Hello and welcome to the last mixtape. My name's Stephen White, and on this week's show we delve into whether or not Gilla Band are the most influential band of the 21st century. But first,
I'm always labelled with horror, but I never think about horror myself specially. I work as near to my instinct as I possibly can, and it's all I can do.
not my words, but the words of Francis Bacon. Why, dear listener, and indeed, dear viewer, are we quoting Francis Bacon at the beginning of this week's episode? Well, dear listener, and indeed, dear viewer, I thought that this week we'd talk about how I think Gilla Band are the 21st century's most influential band. And as always before the show, I'd like to say that the last mixtape is completely vibes and vibes alone, and this is my opinion on how I think that Gilla Band are one of the most important bands of the 21st century so far, not just in Ireland, but everywhere. And of course, I'm just talking about bands here. Artists, well, that's a completely different conversation, and it's far, far broader. But dive in with me as we discuss Gilla Band. Gilla Band are a band who, much like Francis Bacon, paint not with strokes but with feedback, with long looping screams, with a kind of distortion that doesn't just break the rules of rock music, it seems to tear them limb from limb. It's hard to describe Gilla Band to someone who hasn't felt them, because listen isn't the right word. You don't just listen to Gilla Band, you withstand them, you submit to their all-encompassing noise. Their music doesn't entertain, it doesn't soothe, it erupts, it claws, it convulses. And somehow, in the middle of all that, it tells the truth. Like Francis Bacon's paintings, all twisted flesh and screaming mouths, Gilla Band's music captures something few others dare to. The absurd horror of modern life, the pressure of existence under capitalism, the trauma of performance, the bitter humour in trying to hold yourself together when everything around you, including yourself, feels like it's falling apart. They sound like the body turning itself inside out. In a world where noise has become a permanent background radiation, this isn't about being the biggest band in Ireland, or the most streamed, or being the most accessible. This is about influence. And the strange, unsettling truth is, more and more of today's most vital artists, from Fontaines D.C. to Sprints, from Thumper to Black Midi, are not following a polished path. They're following the scream in the dark. They're following Gilla Band. So in this episode, I want to make a case, not just for the brilliance of their legacy, but for Gilla Band themselves, for the idea of the band, this uncompromising, uncommercial, almost unknowable group. Because influence isn't about reach, it's about impact and what echoes after the shock. If you want to follow the shape of Gilla Band's sound, you do not follow a straight line, more a jagged edge. A fracture that breaks through the sound, jagged, twitching, and always just on the cusp of falling apart. It starts with the chaos of their debut EP, France 98, which itself was a warning, a shot across the bow, and an insight in what was to come. Much like the half-finished works of Francis Bacon, these were sketches, mangled and contorted, and an insight into the workings and the body of Gilla Band's sound. Even then, in this early incubation period of Gilla Band's sound, it felt like they were pushing and breaking through the sonic spectrum and pushing against the boundaries of their own productions. And it was with their debut album, Holding Hands with Jamie, where they would really show how they could both harness and use this power as something different, something contorted, and something menacing within a scene that had lost quite a lot of that. You have to remember that back around this time, bands like Gilla Band and what would become Idols and bands like Black Midi weren't as prevalent as they are now. Indeed, the scene had kind of softened to soft synth sounds and beats where the music has changed a little and there wasn't as enough menacing sound as there is now. At its heart was Dara Kiley's narration of sorts, a shrieked vocal that itself called back to the Falls' Marquis Smith. There was part trauma, part comedy, part surrealism, again mirroring the own sound, or the feel rather, of Francis Bacon's work. Itself a contortion of shapes, a contortion of ideas, a contortion of words that were relatable but also had a kind of an otherworldly feel. Gilla Band weren't also following trends. They weren't moving with what would become the great post-punk revival of the mid-2010s. They themselves were something different. Their noise rock influences meant that they were abstracting that sound. They were challenging what was around them, and they sounded like a scream into what was, at the time, as I say, a quite quiet music scene. This raw sound of their debut would introduce them to a much wider audience, one that they would influence for years to come. And while mental health issues would force the band into a hiatus between the periods, their comeback album, The Talkies, was just as filled with this feeling of contortion, of trauma, relief, and itself a confrontation of the raw humanity at play. The Talkies is an unwelcoming, heavy, claustrophobic album that mirrors what had come before it. It showed a band that had travelled through quite a lot before or since their debut album, Holding Hands with Jamie, and had come out as something far more mature, far more menacing, and far more willing to face into that kind of the black and then into the void, as it were, if we were to steal a couple of lines from philosophy. The Talkies is an anxious record, and it feels like that. Throughout the album, it has almost panic attacks at its heart. It feels like an album that is trying to exorcise quite a lot of demons and quite a lot of raw energy. We would see some of this echoed indeed in the Fontaines' most recent album, Starburster, where Grian Chanton calls back to a panic attack of his own, using that heavy breathing as almost a hook within the verses, showing how Fontaines had kind of taken and integrated parts of the Gilla Band sound into their own and into their own ideas. This is why Gilla Band weren't just influencing the generation of new artists and new bands coming, they were influencing the way we look at art, the way we process art and how it is processed by us. They were saying that mental health and mental health issues were part of the work. They were part of the milieu, and they integrated them in sharp relief. And that's where their most recent record, Most Normal, comes in. While still abrasive and still raw and still contorted, there's a far more directive feel of the sound. This wasn't just Gilla Band ripping it up and starting again and putting it all back together. This had corners to it. It had sharp angles to it. It felt more cubist than surreal. It felt more aligned and more angular than their previous work. Still, the undercurrent of it, the band themselves making that washing, growling, kind of far distant sound made the album all the more compelling and makes their work all the more compelling. It's that trio or triptych of albums that shows a beginning, middle and end, and perhaps what is to come from the Gilla Band so far. Showing that each album isn't just a progression, it's a mutation of what has come before. The contortion continuing to twist into shapes that are defined as guitars, defined as bass, defined as lyrics, defined as drum sounds, but in a very different and kind of deconstructed feel. The deconstruction of Gilla Band's work throughout their career has been what has called people to them. And oftentimes that sound can be too much. It can be just, the idea of throwing spaghetti at the wall, make noise and hope that it sounds arty. With Gilla Band, you always feel that there's a meaning and there's a meter to what they do, even if it is just the feel of it that makes you feel. Every record feels like an exposed wound, one that has been delved into for the listener to feel and themselves to experience. The seeds of Gilla Band are everywhere if you know where to listen. Not just in the noise, but in the nerve, in the unease that crackles beneath most modern post-punk and noise music. It's in the contorted vocal performance of James Charlie Steen, the way he sounds like he's crawling out of his own mouth. It's in Idols, whose sonic boom bass masks a frantic vulnerability. And in Black Midi, in their disinterest in resolution, in hooks, in comfort. They too embrace the lurching chaos. They too understand that disorientation can be the truth. But it's not just about sonics, it's about the ethos of Gilla Band, a refusal to explain themselves, to clean up, to make sense. Where so much modern guitar music still feels desperate to be liked, Gilla Band dared to be alienating. They trusted that discomfort can be honest, even liberating. That influence shows up closer to home too. Fontaines may have the swagger and lyricism, but listen to Starburster. The sound at the start, the panicked staccato breath, isn't just an aesthetic choice. It's a direct lineage from the opening of the Talkies, where panic was the prelude. Not metaphor, but reality. Grian Chanton isn't copying, he's challenging. And then there's Sprints. Carla Chubb's vocal delivery, raw, volatile, cracked open in performance. There's something in her voice, that same visceral edge, where emotion is not performed but expelled. It's not about imitating Gilla Band, it's about inheriting their permission. The permission to sound unwell, the permission to sound real. That's the legacy, not in chart positions or streaming numbers, but in creative courage. In a generation of artists who realised you don't have to tidy your chaos into courses, you can just let it bleed. Gilla Band didn't just break the rules, they showed they were never there anyway. Only noise. And indeed, that's all why I wanted to do this episode. I remember a couple of years ago in 2019, I was at one of Gilla Band's homecoming shows from their hiatus in Vicar Street. And what a cathartic show that was. It was very interesting to see both the crowd's reaction and the industry's reaction to their return. They were very most welcome back to the Irish music scene, but the music as a whole and the scene as a whole. It felt like a cathartic moment for the band, and it seemed like their music more than matched the catharsis on stage and off stage. People wanted Gilla Band back, and they wanted to hear this music back, and most importantly, they wanted also to see Darragh Kiley back singing and creating art again. And once again, he was absolutely incredible. It was an amazing show, and one of the highlights was when they did the track Why They Hide the Bodies Under My Garage, and the whole place just came unglued. It's amazing. I'm far too old to be in mosh pits now, or even back then, so I did stay to one side of it, but it was an incredible show, and it was one of a series actually of incredible shows I was witness to that year. I believe a couple of months or after that, Murder Capital would play Vicar Street as well. I would also see Murder Capital and the Fontaines and the Mary Wallopers all play the Three Olympia before the lockdown happened at the Rock Against Homelessness gig. And it really did feel like the Irish music industry was moving into that world where we were creating not just great rock bands, but rock bands and indie bands and noise rock bands that had something to say on a more global stage, that it was not this insular thing, that the influence of Gilla Band had fed into these bands that were going to go on and take it on in different ways. Fontaines and Gilla Band do not sound very similar in a lot of ways. There's a lot of difference there. There's a lot of, you would say that the Fontaines have a sound that is more akin to what you would hear in the kind of the post-punk verve, in especially in their early work on Doggerel, while a feral album, not nearly as feral as Holding Hands with Jamie. But that's not the point. It feels like when you went to those gigs, especially in the Vicar Street, that there was a reverence that those bands had to Gilla Band. I know that in certain ways, firsthand from my day-to-day job, working in a music school, I can see that influence of young bands wanting to sound and wanting to feel a little bit more like Gilla Band, and wanting to know how it's done and how to do it. You can see it a lot of times in bass players who have incredibly distorted basses and that are not playing traditional ways. But how gratifying and amazing is that, to see that bands now are kind of taking on that abstractness. I always call back to a great quote by Brian Eno when he was talking about John Cage, and I don't believe their relationship was very strong, let's say. But he was speaking about John Cage, and he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that it's good to know, it's like an Antarctic explorer, and it's good to know that there's someone out there in the very far reaches in the Antarctic exploring and finding new worlds, but how much he preferred to live in the south of France. And that's from Brian Eno, who himself is quite an experimental artist. But it's interesting how he saw John Cage that way. You could liken Gilla Band in that way to John Cage. I know we're talking more in the lines of Francis Bacon and the contortion of shape and the contortion of a medium. But John Cage himself was somebody who contorted music and looked at it a different way. Gilla Band do that in a very accessible way. It's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do noise rock in a way that doesn't feel, like you're trying to mask problems or you're trying to mask inability, but you're actually doing it because there's an ethos behind it. And you feel that with Gilla Band. It feels that those kind of references, Bacon, Cage, people like that, are relevant, whether or not the band themselves would cite them as kind of as influences themselves. I'm sure they're, as we say, they're not created in a vacuum. We talk about the great Marquis Smith, and you can see that Darragh Kiley does, whether he would admit to it or not, owe a lot to the great Marquis Smith and his style of performance. Indeed, I saw Marquis Smith play the Button Factory many years ago, and he had his back to the audience for quite some time, but the audience had a real connection with him. And I feel that's the same with bands that are coming up now. We were just referencing them there, and that how they have the standing on the shoulders of giants, or the kind of taking those references and making their own art. And that's very important to say, that these bands aren't ripping off Gilla Band in any way, in the same way that Gilla Band aren't ripping off The Fall in any way. It's just taking influence from the world around you, and how important that is to art, and how important that is to the process. When I say that Gilla Band are one of the most influential, or the most influential band of the 21st century, and at the beginning of this thesis when I was writing it, I was going to say that they were in Ireland, but I don't think that's true anymore. I think they are beyond that. I think that their influence is beyond that. In the same way that people might look, and this sounds funny now, with about 50 years later, people would say it about the Ramones or the Velvet Underground. People, Velvet Underground and Nico, they say like only about a couple of thousand people bought the album, but those 1,000 people made such great work. You also see it in the old stories about Sex Pistols playing in Manchester, and there was about 12 people in the audience, but everyone in that audience went out and did something. There's a great scene in the film 24 Hour Party People, where Steve Coogan, who's playing Tony Wilson, the owner of Factory Records, kind of points that out, that this guy over here, these guys are Joy Division. These guys are already the Buzzcocks. I think there's somebody, he's a postman, but these are kind of the seeds. And sometimes, it's the fruit we pay attention to, not so much the tree. I've spoken about, the fruit, that art is the fruit in our society, but the tree, in this sense, in this kind of this kind of scenario, is Gilla Band and their influence. And that's not to diminish their popularity either. As I say, they're an incredibly popular band. Tonight they will be playing in Dublin, and they'll be playing, at the time of recording this, be playing with Iggy Pop in Into the Meadows in the RDS in Kilmainham, and what a stage and what a show that will be. But they're a band that defy convention, and it's interesting to look at the time in which they came up, and to look at what happened after them, and what seeds have grown from their work and from their music. I know that they are, I don't know where their career is next. We don't know what the next album will be from them. I hope we hear another one. I'm sure we will. But it'll be interesting. I hear that they're going to be trying out new material, so that'll be very interesting as well. And I think they're just a band whose ability to defy convention, and again, to go back to that John Cage idea, the willingness to go out to the Antarctic and to explore and bring back things for people to listen to. And that's in all types of art. We're talking about Francis Bacon. I recently visited the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin, somewhere I go quite often. And I, to be honest with you, a lot of the time I just rush straight through to the Bacon exhibition there. If you've never been to Dublin, Francis Bacon has his actual artistic space, his studio, was transported and put into the gallery at Hugh Lane. It's something quite amazing, the mess and the chaos in there, and the stuff that he created, and the contortion. And if you listen to the interviews, his talk about shape, it's not enough to just document things. Shape says things. And I think that's what Gilla Band do with music. I think they take the shape of guitars, the shape of melody, the shape of rhythm, and do something interesting with them to make them have more definition and more sound to them. And I think that's why I feel they are going to be seen as one of the 21st century's most influential bands. That's not to say that they're going to be number one everywhere and they're going to sell out stadiums, and that's a different argument. And that's why I say artists is a different one, because there's a lot of solo artists who very well may pay claim to this. But I think in the realms of, if you want to call it indie music, if you want to call it rock music, you want to call it post-punk, Gilla Band will definitely be up there in the conversation, and to me they are. And I think, to me, it's that willingness to experiment, but in a way that feels concise, and a way that feels measured, and a way that feels informed. Whether or not they would like this essay, I don't think they would, is kind of immaterial in a way. But it's interesting, those kind of mavericks and those people that take those risks. As I say, with the Velvet Underground and the Ramones and people like that, it takes a bit of time for that legendary status to become known. And you might be watching this and you already know Gilla Band, you already know the Fontaines and stuff like that, and there's a literacy already there. But in the wider context, the bands that Gilla Band have influenced will influence more bands. You only have to look at Fontaines, and I'm sure they are influencing more and more bands, and the more popular they get. And that comes from, in a way, from that kind of root. And that's not to say that the Fontaines are only influenced by Gilla Band, of course not. You can hear bits of the Beach Boys in there, and people would say Whipping Boy. There's all sorts as well. I mean, Gilla Band themselves could probably call back to Whipping Boy, would call back to The Fall, and it's one big conversation, and that's what music and that's what art is. That's why we're talking about Francis Bacon. This is one big conversation. Art has always been one big conversation, and what a beautiful conversation it is. Sometimes it's nasty and it's ugly and it's all these types of things, but it's so important. Not to say that the Irish music scene is under some sort of the golden age of Irish music, and hopefully if you're watching from abroad that you have already heard of Gilla Band. If you haven't, wow, tell me in the comments if you listen to them what you think. But I'd be very interested in that if you're not familiar with them. But I think they will be seen in that way. In the way, and I think it's interesting. I was thinking about this on the way in of like other Irish bands, and people maybe who like Gilla Band may not like it, but U2 would probably be seen as that. The great Rory Gallagher would be seen probably as one of the most influential guitarists of all time, and the people who he influenced being influenced again and creating great music later on in their career. Actually, I think The Edge was influenced by Rory. And obviously the great Phil Lynott. So Irish music and Irish bands have a rich history of influencing the world around them and influencing the music scenes around them. So in a way, Gilla Band are just taking part in what is the great art of the Irish conversation and the great art of the Irish voice in the wider context of the music world. Gilla Band never asked to be understood, and maybe that's the point. Their work doesn't offer answers, it resists clarity. But in doing so, it captures something more honest than explanation. The feeling of being alive in a body, in a city, in a system, where none of it makes sense. Their legacy won't be tidy. You won't find it in box sets or anniversaries. You'll find it in the feedback loop of young bands in a basement, trying to scream something real into a broken mic. In the breath before the first lyric, when panic becomes rhythm. Into permission to fall apart, loudly, beautifully, and on your own terms. And that's the future they've carved out, much like Bacon's Shapes and Shadows. One where influence doesn't mean imitation, but the courage to sound like no one else. Like the mad scientists of the noise rock scene, Gilla Band took music, put it through a thresher, disassembled it, and then reassembled it in their own image, creating a music that was singular, but itself would influence many. Indeed, like that gig at Vicar Street, their music gives people the permission, the catharsis to leave go and delve into those raw, emotive feelings of pushing and pulling against what is the void. And just like Francis Bacon, in 50 years' time, people won't remember the charts. We do not have a gallery, an art gallery for our music. We don't put it up on the wall, and we won't be able to see Gilla Band's rehearsal space maybe kind of kept in the same way that Bacon's gallery was. But like Bacon, their influence will go far, far beyond those physical means. They will go into the minds and into the influences and inspirations of many bands to come, whether they know it or not. Their influences are their influences, and so forth and so on. Like that analogy of the tree and a twisted and contorted one, the fruit that bears the name will come out in the end. And Gilla Band will be seen as one of the 21st century's most influential bands of all time. And they come from Ireland. But what about you? Do you think that Gilla Band are the most influential band of the 21st century? Is this hyperbole? Who do you think are the most influential band of the 21st century? It may be someone I've never heard of. If it is, I want to hear about it. If you think it's Gilla Band, let me know. What's your favourite song? What's your favourite album? What do you think they're going to come up with next? What do you like about them? If you don't like them, let me know as well. I want to hear that too. I want to hear both sides of it. But that's my thesis. Gilla Band, one of the most influential bands of the 21st century. So it goes, and there it went. But before I go, thank you for watching and listening to The Last Mixtape. To help the channel grow, please like, share and subscribe for more episodes like this. And if you want to send your music on to the Count and Monty playlisto, do send them on to stephen@thelastmixtape.com and I will send him on your correspondences. But for now, that was The Last Mixtape. I was Stephen White. You were the listener and the viewer. Hey, so long.